Dear friends, we are beginning our international online discussion, Museum Volunteer Society, Challenges of Today and Perspectives for the Future. We had almost 200 people register for our discussion from 144 regions. Not people come not only from Russia, they also come from abroad. Well, we still have people adding to the discussion. I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Matthew Hick from London, who is the head of the volunteer service in the science museums and the heritage as well. Vera Shengelia from Moscow, deputy director from the Polytechnical Museum. Natalia Kirshina from Vologda, and she's the head of the Semenkovo Open Air Architectural Museum, which is a branch of the Vologda major large open air museum. Inna Prilezhaeva and me, Yulia Matskevich, will be moderating the discussion. But before we begin the discussion and the presentations, I'll give the floor to Oksana Fodina. She's the head of the programs at the Potanin Foundation. Well, Oksana, the floor is yours. You have to pick up the mic. Well, good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. On behalf of the charity foundation, Potanin Charity Foundation, I'm very happy to welcome you all to the discussion. Those who will present their speeches and everybody who's joining us. Supporting museum projects and museum professionals has been the job for the Potanin Foundation for many years, and in our portfolio we have a couple of competitions. And they're met with a lot of interest because we have a lot of quality applications we receive for each competition. Contemporary museums are developing, are evolving, and apart from traditional kinds of work, they start and launch a lot of partnership initiatives, and volunteering in art and in culture is really developing fast. This is a trend which is fast developing all over the world, and we see that in Russia we're also getting more and more experience and some positive practices and examples. For the foundation, volunteering in the museums is a very important topic. We have already published 2 brochures about volunteering practices in the museums of Russia. In 2015, the fund has launched a nomination for the best volunteer project within the Intermuseum Festival, International Festival, and this nomination is part of the festival competition program. Apart from project ideas, we thought it was very important to support volunteers whose personal stories of interactions with museums could serve as examples, as inspiring examples for other people. We think that, I mean, people do not always notice volunteers working in museums, but this work is very, very important. And we're seeing volunteers not only helping to organize work in the museum, but they also are involved in cataloging, in working on publications. They take part in restoration works. And last year, when we initiated this competition, sorry, it was in 2019, not in 2015, we wanted to celebrate the input that comes from the volunteers. This year, we're having a second cycle for this competition. Unfortunately, the pandemic has changed our plans, and we had to postpone our live the program. We were planning it for May this year, But thanks to these two cycles of this competition, we now have a lot of materials about volunteering practices in Russia, some personal stories of the volunteers, and we uh, would use it as a basis, as an analytical basis for our future programs. And we support this kind of research about museum volunteering in Russia. And we hope that our today's meeting will be a kind of a beginning for this research. All the crises that I've mentioned, and this is something we all have to deal with. This crisis helped us share solidarity, and it gives a new meaning to this kind of work. And for us, supporting volunteers has become even more important. We are now not limiting ourselves to supporting museum volunteers only. As a response to this crisis situation, the foundation has launched 3 grant competitions: Common Cause, New Dimension, and Philanthropy School. And the budget for these competitions is 900 million rubles. And these competitions are meant to support volunteer initiatives that help us support the people who are not protected otherwise. And I wish we all have a fruitful day today. Thank you for your attention. Well, thank you very much, Oksana, for your greeting and for your welcome words. And now I would like to give the floor to our moderator, to the executive director of the Cultural Managers Association, Inna Prilezhaeva. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm happy uh, that we're having a thunderstorm in Moscow, so we have some dramatic background to our meeting. For us, this talk, this discussion is very, very important. It kind of launches this research and of research of the potential that museum volunteering has. Um, the current situation helped us discover the changes in the museums and the way we reflect on the museum, on its functions, has reached a new level. And we have a hypothesis that volunteering as a topic might have a future in the sense how we discuss new scenarios for social partnerships and the way and the society and museum influence each other. A lot is now being said about volunteering both on all levels, both on the government level and on the institution level. Uh, and the issue of volunteering culture as a kind of leisure education, etc., is now being researched, and the involvement of society, the participation of society, of communities, is now seen as a very important factor. It is also being researched how volunteering influences social, cultural capital. We also want to understand how does this volunteering can influence a museum. What contexts are important in this regard? Of course, I mean, one of the first very important contexts is that of generations. When we're talking about people who are retiring, about the elderly, volunteering has to do with value systems, with the ability that older people get to influence what's going on in the world. And it also has to do a lot with the technological context. And we had to jump in a sense, into this technological context. We had a discussion with the winners of the last year's competition, and we want to go on with this discussion this year as well. And we're trying to find out what scenarios of partnership and mutual influence can we find. What should we plan for the museums and for the volunteers? Can a volunteer influence a museum? It is very important for us to start this discussion in international context, and uh, I want to emphasize how happy we are to have a partner, the Heritage Group, headed by Matthew Hick. And I'm also talking about the Science Museums Group. Over the years, we had a lot of training courses for museum professionals, and Potanin Foundation, who has had great experience in arranging these uh, training um, trips. We have differences, we have some specific outcomes and effects, and I think this is something we should talk about today. I give the floor to Yulia, and I think we can begin the discussion. Yes, well, we also need to remember that we have to keep uh, our talk, our discussion within the time frame. We're having like an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes. I think this is as much as we're gonna spend together with our Russian and international colleagues. I'm happy to see winners of our last year's competition for museum volunteers and this year winners and museum professionals who recommended those volunteers. And I suggest uh, uh, the winners would switch on their screens. Maybe we'll see more of your faces on the screen. It'll be very pleasant, and maybe we'll have a screenshot done. When we thought about this competition, when we planned it, the Potanin Foundation and the Cultural Managers Association, who run this competition, um, they only looked at one way of defining volunteering in museums on the basis of the institutional approach. So what we were interested in volunteers who are linked to museums. Well, it was a formal approach. It helps us museum professionals have a more specific discussion on volunteers, or maybe museum volunteering has some specific features of its own. And this is the question we had within the competition, and I think this question is still relevant. And it is relevant for the research that this competition leads us to. I'll just give you a number of figures, a number of numbers. We've been running this competition Museum Volunteer for 2 years, 2019, 2020. We've had about 200 participants and 15 winners. We had both years, so 29 basically, because we had one person who won both competitions. We had 30 regions of Russia taking part in the competition, and these museums were very, very different. Uh, Basically, the whole range of museums you can imagine. And as Oksana and Inna have already mentioned, working with the applications and looking into the volunteer stories that opened up both in applications and in our talks we had with them. All these applications, they make us ask certain questions. What is the context for all of this? The year 2019 was announced in Russia as the year of volunteering. We are now working on a model of volunteering on the infrastructure, volunteering and infrastructure on the regional and national level. So far, we have this feeling or a hypothesis that museum volunteering, in terms of this global process, is kind of specific because it always has a local character, and you usually have a direct link between a volunteer and a museum with no third party involved. So the researchers call this an informal volunteering. So this formal volunteering that is organized by an institution, is when it is planned and systemic and mobile, these features are less evident in museum volunteering. And hence we have the question, I mean, is it so specific for museum volunteering, or maybe it's a stage for a volunteering practice. So without going too deep, we can see certain trends. The first trend is when it starts as a random or random partnership, but it grows into something more stable and regular. We might look at the situation the following way. With this being a predominant mechanism, and not all cases are, are good ones. And it's not always, it doesn't always happen that everybody is lucky in the situation. The volunteer does not always find his or her museum. This work is often spontaneous and unconscious in a sense, which doesn't diminish the results, but the process itself is quite spontaneous. I think that two questions will be important for our discussion today. Will museum redefine itself in today's deprivation and limitations that museums are facing? Will the museum redefine itself, and will it redefine volunteering? Will the museum see new chances, new possibilities in volunteering? I don't want to abuse my role as a moderator, and I would give the floor to our speakers. You know that if moderators abuse their time, they will always reduce time for the speakers. But I have my timer running, so I'm really keeping to the point. And I will remind you, the speakers, if you're going for too long. So as as hospitable hosts, but also since we want to see our Russian volunteering practices in the international context, I would like to give the floor to Matthew Hick, and I have introduced him. Matthew Hick is the head of the volunteering, and he's the president of the Heritage Volunteering Group. So Matthew has 10 to 15 minutes. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me along today. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. We've also got a thunderstorm in England, so although we're many miles apart, perhaps we're together after all. I'm just going to share my screen with you. So if you just bear with me a minute while I load this up, and we'll get started. So just bear with me one moment. So hopefully you can all see that. As I said, my name is Matthew Hick, and I'm head of volunteering at Science Museum Group and the founder and chair of the Heritage Volunteering Group, a peer-to-peer volunteer network that supports volunteer managers across the UK. Today I'm going to talk to you about trends in heritage volunteering across Great Britain and the potential impact that COVID-19 will have on our volunteer programmes. Before I do that, though, I just want to give you some context around volunteering, both at Science Museum and across the UK. So for those of you that don't know, Science Museum Group is comprised of 5 museums: Science Museum, Science and Media Museum, Science and Industry Museum, Locomotion, and the National Railway Museum in York, where I'm based. When I started there as volunteer coordinator 12 years ago, volunteers were a helpful but small part of our workforce, contributing around 15,000 hours a year. After transforming the volunteer programme at the museum and increasing involvement to 40,000 hours a year, I was promoted to my current post as head of volunteering, with the objective of creating a culture of volunteering across all of our museums. Today, we have over 1,000 volunteers contributing over 100,000 hours of support each year. They're an absolutely crucial part of our organisation and are key to helping us achieve both our operational and strategic objectives. They provide support in collections and visitor-facing roles, as well as helping with more administrative tasks. By thinking about how and who we involve in those roles, volunteering is also able to support our strategic goals of building science capital and increasing diversity, something which will be absolutely crucial in a post-COVID-19 world. In 2014, I set up the Heritage Volunteering Group to support volunteer managers across the UK. Volunteers are an absolutely crucial part of the UK's heritage landscape and contribute around £520 million to the sector each year. The contribution that volunteers make to individual organisations is also significant. And based on our 2019 survey, the average UK heritage organisation has 92 volunteers who provide 7,500 hours of support each year. And like at Science Museum Group, that support is spread broadly across a whole range of activities with a focus on visitor-facing and operational roles. What the survey also showed was the value heritage organisations do or do not place on volunteering. At UK minimum wage, we estimate the value of volunteering around £61,000 per year to each organisation. And yet the average spend per organisation is only £2,600. That works out about 61 pence per volunteer per hour. And this represents a significant underinvestment in volunteering over a prolonged period of time. This lack of investment is also seen in the sector's staffing structures, with 57% of organisations either having a junior volunteer management position or no management position at all. This has serious implications for the strategic development of volunteering in our sector, and perhaps more pertinently for this conversation, for the role volunteers will play in helping rebuild our organisations in a post-COVID world. The other thing I'd like to touch on is the composition of our volunteer programmes. Typically, heritage volunteers come from what we call the civic core. This is 9% of the British population who undertake around 52% of its volunteering. They are predominantly healthy, wealthy, white and older people. Almost 60% of heritage volunteers are over the age of 55 and only 5% come from ethnic backgrounds, with less than a quarter being under the age of 34. By engaging with this easy to access group, museums have been able to fulfil their operational needs with relative ease. So why do we need to engage with a more diverse audience when we've got what we need? Well, for me, there are three reasons. The first is that diversity creates a more resilient volunteer programme. The impact of COVID-19 means that many of our older volunteers will be unable to return for health reasons when our museums open. This will put the operation of some organisations at risk. Having more younger volunteers would remove this problem, as they're not having to shield in the same way that our older volunteers are. Secondly, it makes us more relevant to the communities we serve. By working with charities and community groups, we can provide opportunities to the unemployed, the socially isolated, and the disenfranchised that will enhance their life chances and meet our operational needs. And lastly, it enables us to contribute to our organisation's strategic objectives. By considering not only how people volunteer, but who volunteers, we can ensure volunteering serves our strategic objectives. At Science Museum, we might, for example, look to work with people with limited academic qualifications, so we can provide them with experiences that help build their science capital, one of our strategic objectives. But to do this, we need to break free from our traditional approach to recruitment, where we create roles and advertise them on our websites to traditional audiences. What we need to do are three things. Firstly, we need to work with local charities and community groups to create roles and recruit from their client base. This means working collaboratively to develop different models of volunteering that work for the individual as much as they do for us. Secondly, we need to strip back our processes and make it easier for people to volunteer. When you can go on Amazon and buy a book in 30 seconds, it's no longer acceptable for us to have a recruitment process that takes 2 months of application, interviews, vetting, and training. And lastly, we need to create experiences that meet the needs of our new audiences by providing training and events that are of relevance and interest to them. If these principles become the foundation on which we build our volunteer programs, and I believe we can create more resilient, diverse, and strategically powerful volunteer programs. Last month, at the Heritage Volunteering Group, we began work on a paper with Historic England for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. This paper outlines our joint proposal for the role volunteers can play in helping rebuild the sector post-COVID by embedding the principles we've just discussed in our work. To support this paper, we undertook a quantitative survey of our 400 members into organisational approaches to volunteering, readiness for reopening, and the ability to develop volunteering in the future. This data was used to refine and inform our final recommendations to DCMS, and the study produced 3 key findings. Firstly, and linked to my earlier point about organisations not having the staff to develop a strategic approach to volunteering, we recommended that volunteer engagement and support for volunteering needs to become more strategic. 20% of organisations who say volunteers are critical do not have a dedicated volunteer manager. This rises to 23% for the wider sector, suggesting rhetoric around the value of volunteers doesn't match action. I think has my screen disappeared? Oops. I think somebody else has just started sharing their screen mid-presentation. And it's just kicked me out.
Хорошо, мы вас видим.
Oops.
All is fine. We can see you.
Oh, and can you still see my screen? Okay.
No.
It kicked me out. Let me just see, because I think somebody else was sharing their screen. So I'll just see if I can share mine again. Okay. Okay, hopefully you can all see that again. And I'll just come back to that point that I was making there about volunteer engagement and support for volunteering needing to become more strategic. Senior roles leading to volunteer engagement are rare, implying volunteering is seen as an operational, not a strategic issue. Oops. And this is really kind of reflected in the fact that almost 40% of organisations don't have a volunteering strategy, so they don't have the plans in place to develop volunteering over the long term. Secondly, support is needed to develop volunteering and create lasting cultural change. The lack of strategic engagement at a senior level and professional capacity means that organisations are not well equipped to develop new models of volunteering that will create a more diverse volunteer workforce that the current crisis demands. And then lastly, respondents feel generally confident to redeploy their volunteers when their museums open, but they do have some concerns. They're worried about the impact that shielding will have on the scale and capacity of their volunteer workforce, with many of their older volunteers not able to return, and what the impact of this will be on their operations. And they're also very, very concerned about job substitution, the replacement of paid roles by volunteers. Based on these three findings, we made 3 key recommendations. Firstly, volunteer management must be considered a strategic function in order to maximise the effectiveness of volunteering. Secondly, support should focus on enabling organisations to develop new models of volunteering and recruit more diverse volunteer workforce. And lastly, sectoral change should be driven through existing networks and infrastructure organisations to maximise what is now an extremely limited resource. Having just created a new volunteering strategy that reflects these ambitions, Science Museum Group is in a strong position to lead the sector forward. By understanding our cities better, we are creating strategically beneficial programmes that will help transform our museums and our communities. By working in partnership with local charities, we will create more diverse volunteer programmes, ones that are more reflective of our local environments and which are more resilient. Ultimately, we will build a more diverse, inclusive and resilient volunteer programme that serves our strategic ambitions and which inspires futures. Thank you. I don't know whether we want to take questions now or whether we want to come back to them at the end, but I'll hand you back to our moderator. Thank you.
Спасибо большое, Мэтью.
Thank you.
Мы сейчас перейдем, вот обсуждая первые наши 2 вопроса дискуссии, к следующим докладчикам, а потом попробуем скомпоновать вопросы. Мы сейчас говорим о том, какие контексты и тенденции современности будут наиболее значимыми для развития волонтерских программ и как они повлияют на развитие.
Now talk about the
Well, we want to thank Matthew for being so laconic, and you still have time. And you managed to give a very eloquent rendering of your British experience and based on the latest research. I'd like to give the floor to Vera Shengelia, who is a deputy director, general director of the Polytechnical Museum. And there was a question in the chat room whether don't we have official offices for volunteers and no coordinators. No, we do have them, but not every museum has it. I think it applies to every country. Each museum decides for itself how much they put into this volunteering program. And our today's speakers, I think, present very different experiences that museums have. And Vera, you have the floor. Well, good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you, Matthew, for, I mean, it's great to see you, and it's always interesting to compare whether we are far away from each other or sometimes we're very close to each other, which was very nice to hear. And I have a couple of slides to show as well. I'll try to show them and maybe answering the questions posed by the moderator about new challenges and how we face them, how we respond to them, and how we see them in our Polytechnical Museum. In the Polytechnical Museum, we have a volunteering program since 2011. And I wasn't the one behind it. Alexandra Kopernik was probably one of the first people to launch this in Russia. She was the one to organize it. And her inspiration still lives in the community of Polytech volunteers. It's a very friendly community, and these are the people we can rely on. They're always next to us. We see them, we feel them all the time. I have to mention the Sputnik program initiated by the Polytech Museum. Potanin Foundation has always been helping us as well, and has always been a big aid. And we, together with the Potanin Foundation, have published this guideline brochure book that explains tells of certain methods we use working with volunteers. 7 years ago, Polytech has initiated the Sputnik program. It's an association which works for many museums. You can see that we have 14 museums in this association. I don't know if we have colleagues from these museums here who are part of this program, but we have colleagues. We have Sputnik colleagues. I see it in the chat room. And I think so far it's only a general agreement, a framework agreement. But those of you who are members of Sputnik, you know that every year we collect 14 signatures to re-sign our framework agreement. This Sputnik program supports volunteers and develops the environment, and this inter-museum volunteering is fun, telling that it's fun, that it is important, and we're trying to support our volunteers, and we give a lot of opportunities through this green card. All our volunteers have free access to the members of the program museums, and we offer various educational platforms, access to educational platforms, for our volunteers to have a chance to get some resources from their volunteer work. It's our way of saying thank you to them. As for challenges of today and the way we see volunteering work today, I think that Sputnik program now is gaining a new dimension, because these new challenges that we've faced while our museums were closed, while we were learning how to work in Zoom, how we were learning how to transfer our educational programs and our guided tours onto platforms, you've noticed how badly we need each other, how we need each other's experience, advice, instructions, methods. And I think the Sputnik program will give a new impetus. Will gain a new impetus, sorry. And I'm really hoping for that, because with new hardships and new challenges, we find it easier, in a sense, to cope with it together and not to stay on our own in our museum. So this is probably the answer to your first question about this new life and how volunteer programs could be part of this new life. And the second issue that we're facing, and this is something we're trying to work with, is how a museum has rethought, redefined its role in the society, and what is it trying to be in the society. In the Polytech, since the time I'm working there, we have two big programs. The one is called Different People, New Museums, and it is meant for disabled audiences. And we have the first council that includes disabled people and activists who help us create our spaces, who help us create our services to make them inclusive. And thus, we do not decide for the disabled people what kind of a museum they want. It is the people themselves who find out and who work it out. And the second program was called Clouds of Different Sizes and Colors. It was meant to be a program for migrant children. Now we're working with the communities as well. We're working with mothers. Um, um, we had to do it because we saw a lot of people, a lot of women who underwent this trauma of uprooted and brought to a different country, who don't speak Russian really well, and who don't find their way in Moscow, who don't understand how they could support their children in these new circumstances. And so we now have some support groups for the parents, for the migrant families' parents, and we're growing. I mean, this program is growing, and it requires more and more effort and more resources. Both these programs wouldn't be possible without volunteers. Volunteers are playing a very active part in both programs, the one for the disabled audiences and for the migrant children. As any socially oriented project, these projects involve people a lot, and volunteers grow into these programs. They bring their friends, and they get really interested. They become really involved. What is indeed different from the Matthews story is that we don't have uh, uh, that many volunteers who would be 60 plus. I mean, we do have some. Our volunteers are very young people, mostly young people, high school students, uh, students. We have some like people in their 30s, but mostly it's young people, people who are looking for a way to go, people who are in the universities, and social issues, transition issues are very important for them. So these new programs we're running, the ones that are, kind of challenging this social inequality, I think they're bringing us to a different field. Oksana has said that we start to see this sphere in a different way. And the Potanin Foundation is now running programs that support NGOs that work with mentally disabled people, for example. And we still have institutions like asylum, uh, prison-like institutions. And last year we had a discussion for volunteers who work in these asylums and for our museum volunteers. And it was very interesting. We were trying to see where we united, where we decided to help institutions to do it free of charge, and what is different, what makes us different, and what makes us similar. Of course, we found a lot of things that make us very similar, and we have some joint projects. And the bottom right picture shows volunteers from the institutions joining us at our site at the exhibition. And you see our volunteers working with migrant children. And this new kind of work made us face an issue, and volunteers as well. Talking to our volunteers, we found out that they want education. They want educational programs for volunteers of various kinds. And now we are approaching a stage when we're going to work on such program. It will be a model typed program, so each volunteer could choose the types of methods or types of work they want to educate themselves in. And we've already developed a section dedicated to the to understanding of the social model of disability, what makes it difficult to apply this model in Russia, how Russia is striving to go there. And this is our first step in creating a major educational program for volunteers. And it is a high demand for such programs. So if we're talking about challenges, I think this is the second answer to Yulia's second question. So the challenge we face is a challenge we have, and we are expected to deliver educational programs for volunteers. And this is something we're going to work on. I guess that would be it. And I hope I managed to cover it in 15 minutes. Thank you, Vera. I love my chat room. I can see your questions. I'm putting them together, and some of them are very conceptual. I'm trying to work a discussion pattern out. So I think it's very important that we're having a dialogue in the chat room. People are getting to know each other. They're answering questions, each other's questions. And it's great to see that we're having a very professional and community of the people who think alike, despite the fact we come from various backgrounds and various countries. Now I would like to give the floor to our third speaker, Natalia Kirshina. She works in the north, and she's the head of the Semenkovo Museum.
Before I start my presentation, I want to say that I represent a museum under the open sky, like Skansen. They're very popular in Europe, and if my information is correct, it's like there's hundreds of museums like that in Europe. In Russia, there are much fewer of these museums, and we have our own way, in a sense, of development. So now I will share my screen, and I offer our British friends, first of all, to just find out what is Vologda region, who we are. I want to speak about the Semenkovo Museum. It's kind of a complex experience, and it has specificities because it's in Russia. The Vologda region is on the northwest of the Russian Federation. This is an archaic, we can say, ancient Russian north. It's a huge area from west to the east, from north to the south, and here we have traditional lifestyles still present and unique wooden architecture monuments. Now we are becoming more and more touristic. Vologda has a certain brand of being the soul of the Russian North, which kind of includes other brands known in Russia, such as the Vologda Bata, the Vologda Lace, the braided silver. In our museum, Semenkovo is an organic part of this brand, we can say. For you to understand, Vologda is 450 kilometers away from Moscow, and well, from London, it's 2,614 kilometers. Our museum, Architectural and Ethnographical Museum, is located 12 kilometers away from Vologda. We are trying to reconstruct the wooden architecture of the end of 19th century. It's a transportable museum. I mean, the objects that we display were found on the territory of the Vologda region and were brought into the museum. We are creating thus an artificial environment, and we are paying a lot of attention not only to reconstruction of historical objects, but also to attract the audience to our activities. The museum was first devised in 1979 after a major research in the area. And in the early 90s, in 1992, the museum was opened to the public, regardless of the fact that it was only launched recently. Well, those were tough times, but we decided to open, and we're still facing major difficulties, which we have to take into account. I mean, the realities of the region. Presently, our museum has 44 employees. 12 members of scientific staff, and we have 234 volunteers. Active of those are around like 100 volunteers. In our museum, we have all sorts of events, activities, most of all holidays, popular holidays, festivals. And we are quite experienced in that. We are doing this since 2005. And the people of Vologda do come, they are interested, but it used to be more on a case-to-case basis or more spontaneous. But in 2005, we had an internship in Jamsli Museum in Sweden, and our Swedish colleagues were generous enough to explain to us how they work with museums, how they attract them, recruit them. And this really helped us. We do constantly go back to what we learned there. Presently, the museum has moved beyond holidays. We're also trying to deal with complex issues such as daily life of farmers and peasants historically, about the system of their community, about its structure, about the way the land was divided, how conflicts were resolved. I want to say that at some point, for a long time, we were only relying on our own resources. I mean, scientific staff of the museum. We do have specialists, I mean, historians, ethnographers, and yes, the events that we organized were quite popular, but at some point we realized that we are no longer capable of covering the workload. But we wanted to keep doing this, to keep making the museum more live. And we thought of volunteering in a new way. We remembered what we learned from our European colleagues. and we prepared a grant application from Potanin Foundation, and we received the financial support for the project, The Right to Destiny. We organized a school for museum interpreters, a school of museum interpretation. The museum volunteers received a number of opportunities through this project. On the slide, you see how many volunteers we recruited. The grant from the Potanin Foundation, as I said, served to launch this School of Museum Interpreters. We called the city, the people of Vologda, we invited them to join us as museum interpreters. I mean, we designed a program of museum interpreting, which included classes on history, ethnology, folklore, choreography, um, acting, museology, and we invited the best specialist scientists specializing in folklore. We were afraid that the audience would not engage with us because the program is quite intense. It's 2-3 times a week coming to class, finding, allocating their own free time and to concentrate, to focus, to do homework as well, to learn, let's say, roles or parts for acting or analyzing certain texts. But we were lucky enough, more than 50 persons applied, and we selected 45 out of them. And that was a wonderful project. I want to say that people were very diverse in terms of age, let's say from 18 to 74 years old. And we were very happy to welcome all of them because the northern village is multi-generational. There have to be people of various ages. Those people are not professional actors, but they are bright personalities. They are charismatic. They have their own life experience, which they want to share. And we gathered an ensemble, a band, including the youth, the elderly, people interacting within our museum programs. And we are actually capable of reconstructing an authentic village. The most loyal volunteers who were very active during the program actually helped us to build a new line of activity in our museum, anthropological theater, also engaging our museum interpreters. And in 2019, we had a premiere of the theater piece, the Groom. It's both a cultural and a scientific statement because it's a historical document being critically analyzed, documents critically reviewed. And it was a story of a young lady who was not destined to marry the guy that she was in love with and her adventures. And we were invited to take part in the International Theatre Festival, The Voices of History. That all happened thanks to the volunteers. The museum has become a major resource to visualize the historical experience. Thanks to our museum interpreters, we were capable of telling about the lifestyle, the relationship between the people inside the village of the age of the 19th and the 20th century, and do it expressively, do it in an enticing way, because actually our people were well prepared for that, and those activities had positive economic impacts. Our volunteers during the summer period, when we have a lot of tourists coming, from May to October. They would come every weekend, every Saturday and Sunday, and play little theater pieces in the decorations of this authentic northern village. And that helped us greatly in major events that we organized on big holidays. At the same time, I would like to underline several challenges that we are facing as a museum. We do understand that people who come as volunteers, they are people who are in a difficult life situation. They are going through things, maybe a loss, maybe a disillusionment, maybe a breakup. And also, we were surprised to find out that some of our volunteers have major medical conditions, cancer, and these things come up only in discussions. We had to work through the stereotypes around the topic, around how people think or imagine how people in the village used to live. And we had to deal here with the Soviet legacy, the special stereotypes in this area, and we had to find the right arguments, find the proper language to find, to be delicate enough, to have the tact, to have compassion in order not to lose those volunteers. But this requires from museums, curators, and scientific staff immense emotional involvement. And we are thinking now about how to protect the staff, the museum staff, from emotional burnout. We are quite a small team, 12 permanent members. We cannot allocate a person a special position. And Matthew said that it's good to have a position, someone who works specifically with volunteers. We can't do that. Curating volunteers is a task that is distributed through among the staff, and it's difficult. Our museum is quite remote. We don't have offices there. We don't have workplaces. We don't have even volunteers headquarters, a special place for them, and that does have a negative impact on our work, and it's extra emotional. It adds extra emotional load on the staff. And you know how it's very painful when you do invest in a volunteer. You invest your love and your time, and then they leave you. There can be a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes they move away. Sometimes they get married. They have children. They get sick, or maybe they are disappointed. Or their expectations were not met. There is a turnover of volunteers anyway, so we are constantly thinking of how to find and recruit new volunteers. When we had the financial support from the grant, we did have the opportunity to bring in specialists, scientists, people who are working in, let's say, in the acting industry, actors, directors. But now we have to plan. We have to, we're trying to keep the balance. We're trying to be attractive, to stay attractive to the audiences, and we have to find inner reserves, and we have to restructure our organization. We have to find new financial possibilities to keep doing what we're doing. So we are constantly thinking, constantly reflecting on what's going on. We're thinking, are we doing things in the right way or in the wrong way? Um, we have to convince people a lot. I mean, sometimes people are just narrow-minded. Even though volunteering does have support in our country, but still, Okay, well, unfortunately, the time is off. The time is up. Well, I'm saying that working with volunteers, it's a huge responsibility. You have to rethink your activities, and then you have to search for additional resources. Well, okay, colleagues, I can see the questions in the chat about the age of the volunteers, about for how long the volunteers normally stay in the museum. But well, let's see if we have enough time to answer all of those questions, because our discussion is more conceptual. So now we are we're moving to the next topic of our discussion. Let's think about the following question about finding the balance between the investing in volunteers and the benefits that we get from them. So now I will give each of the panelists an opportunity to answer that question. Well, what are the impacts, volunteering impacts, both of volunteers and for the organization, how they can be monitored and measured in the sense of how do we build the plans in this area for, well, Matthew, you will be probably the first to answer that question.
Hello there. Yes, I've actually prepared something to say on this point, but I think what I'd like to just touch on first is the importance of volunteer managers to organisations to enable museums to do more with their volunteers, to have a greater impact, to retain volunteers for longer. And it's really interesting to hear so many people talk about the lack of volunteer management resource that there is within museums in Russia. And I guess kind of what I would come back to is volunteer managers are a really great investment. They, if we look at Science Museum Group, prior to 2015, when the head of volunteering post was created, volunteers gave somewhere between 50 to 40,000 hours a year to the organisation. The creation of that post resulted in the organisation doubling volunteer involvement to over 100,000 hours. So that in itself pays for that role more than double. So I would say the return on investment by creating volunteer roles is absolutely significant, because those volunteers that are coming into your organisation, they can allow you to do more, they can conserve more objects, they can enhance the visitor experience. So by investing in those roles, you're getting so much back. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that point first, because I feel it's really important. In terms of the question around the impact that volunteering makes within our sector, I've just got a little something that I have prepared, and how we kind of measure volunteering impact at Science Museum Group. So I'll just take you through that. I mean, as we've already seen, volunteering has a significant positive impact on our museums, our volunteers, and the communities we serve. By helping us care for our collections and support our visitors, they enable us to deliver more than we ever could without them. Beyond this, volunteering has been shown to have a huge health and well-being benefits, as we've discussed already today, and also allows us to provide opportunities for personal development and training. And by targeting those volunteering opportunities at those most in need within our local area, we can improve their well-being, support their development, and have a huge social impact. And it's been great to hear the stories that we've heard from the other two speakers. They've been really, really inspiring. At Science Museum Group, delivering these three outcomes is key to our volunteering strategy and the future of volunteering at our museums. So for each of our museums, we have a two-part volunteering plan in place. The first part of that plan explores our strategic and operational needs within the local context with which we're developing our volunteer programs. And this gives us an understanding of what the societal needs are and the challenges, as well as providing an overview of the demographic and socio-economic composition of the city. The second part of that report then outlines how we can deliver a volunteer program that meets both our operational and strategic needs in a way that will have the greatest social impact. Within this report, we look at the roles we'll create, the partners we'll work with, the budgets we'll need, and that provides us with a whole overview of what volunteering will look like, what we'll deliver within our museums through volunteers, and how we'll address societal issues within our cities. And those reports are absolutely fundamental to how we will develop volunteering moving forwards. The way that we'll measure the impact and success of those volunteer programs is really kind of split into 4 areas. So the first part is the scale of our volunteer program, so the number of activities that the volunteers will deliver, the number of volunteers, and the number of hours that they give each year. At the moment, volunteers deliver around 70 to 75 roles across the group, with volunteers giving, as I say, 100,000 hours to our museums. The next area that we'll look at is to track diversity across a whole range of demographic indicators. Thirdly, we'll measure the quality of our volunteer programme, so the impact that they have on volunteers and their well-being. And lastly, we measure the outcomes of volunteering across a range of front-of-house and back-of-house roles. So this might, for example, include number of objects digitised, number of questions answered, number of objects conserved, those sorts of things. And then by blending these measures together, we're much better able to understand our progress towards delivering our volunteering strategy. And we're also able to create a much more compelling narrative, which really kind of fully demonstrates the value of volunteering to Science Museum Group. So that's kind of a very quick overview of impact and the way that we measure that impact. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of context about what we do at Science Museum. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. Just to specify, you said that you have a prognosis, for social tasks. Can you give maybe some index examples?
So this is a new volunteering strategy and a really new way of working for us. So that's why hearing the examples that we've heard today has been so inspiring, because at the moment we have a very traditional approach to working with volunteers, and that's very much about us creating roles and advertising those roles to our traditional audience who come in and deliver what we need them to do. So it's very difficult for me to actually say at the moment to point to really good examples where we've have been able to kind of have that social impact. The best example that I can give comes from a few years ago at the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, where we worked with on a project called Inspiring Futures, which was designed to give people on the fringes of society an opportunity to volunteer with us and to gain skills and to go on and find employment. And it was such a powerful project to be involved with. Volunteers would come in, they would volunteer with one of 3 main host organisations within the city, of which we were one of the organisations. So we would take a group of, say, 12 volunteers in. We would then provide them with visitor experience training. We would provide them with qualifications, so official kind of qualifications as well, in kind of visitor service training, museum training, object handling training, lots of the museum-based skills. And then we would give them an opportunity to volunteer with us for a 6 to 12 week period, and then they would go and volunteer at another partner organisation, so that they would have lots of different experiences, not only from volunteering with us, but also volunteering across Manchester. And that had a significant effect. And we often talk about the social return on investment, so the value that we get back socially. And so we talk about, for every £1 invested, we get £2.60 worth of social return on investment, and that's around the improvements to an individual's health and well-being, their ability to return into work. It's all calculated into this figure. But for me, the most powerful impact of that project was speaking to a volunteer who literally said, I was at death's door. I was ready to kill myself before I took part in this project, and this has absolutely transformed my life, and I'm now going to go back to my family, and I'm going to start work again. And that for me is the power of volunteering in a nutshell, and it's why I've been involved in volunteering for so long, because you just don't get those experiences and that ability to have such a positive impact in people's lives in other areas of work.
Спасибо большое, Мэтью. Да,
Well, thank you very Matthew. I think that we can't really calculate the effects in pounds. We're impressed by the precision of your calculations. We have noticed from in the photos that volunteers in the UK are often working with the collection. Actually, it's not a common thing in Russia, but it was kind of a surprise. I would like to give the floor to. We'll follow the same order. I'll give the floor to Vera. Speaking of the way we assessment tools, how do we measure this effect? We always want to measure something to assess. How do we do that? To let ourselves know that we are following the right track, and to show the others that volunteers are important. Well, I don't want to give you high hopes. I don't have an answer to this question. I think that speaking of assessment and measurement of the efficiency of volunteer programs or anything we do in the museum, in terms of the money we're making, I mean, it's a very hot topic in Russia. Now, all our programs, educational programs, visitors programs, we eventually don't know how successful they are, whether they reach the goals that we have. The only measurement tool we have is the number of tickets we sell. This year was the first season we tried to plan our educational tools using the GLO instrument. This is an instrument used was first used in the UK, and we found out how difficult it is, how many discussions it brings forward. Our tech people think they think you have a problem with the sound. Please let us know who's having problems with the sound. Check your sound. Maybe you need to reload or reconnect. Maybe there's something wrong with your computer. Just make sure you're. Well, getting back to efficiency measurement, you know that in Russia we have this association that assesses social projects. If any of you have been to conferences and discussions, you know how complex it is and how difficult it is to measure or to assess the social effect of the program. We don't have a ready-made answer. We keep thinking about it. I can list indicators we find important, the indicators that we look at or see as success factors. There was a question, how many volunteers do we have in Polytech? And we have 1,700 applications, and we have 500 volunteers who are involved on a regular basis. We have 100 volunteers who have been with us for several years already, and they work on a monthly basis. And we have 40 volunteers who are the core, the community. These are the people we meet every week. And during this pandemics, we've been, trying to support each other and, involve each other. This is the closest community. So we have a multi-layered structure. Speaking of what is important for us, we have several model cases that we use as examples. One of our favorite volunteers, we love them all. One of our favorite volunteers, Misha, came to us when he was 11. He volunteered in the Polytech lab, and biology. No, it was a math lab, and he would come and help to conduct classes and handouts, spread handouts. Now he's in his first year in the Physical and Technological University, and he's still with us. and he's now graduated from the first year of the communicators school. And this involvement, this kind of involvement, when people go with us, is an important indicator for us. It means that we we are able to be this flexible, and people find it interesting to stay with us when they're 14 and when they're like students, university students, or maybe grown-ups. Another important thing we're trying to keep up with, I mean, to keep people who work with who with volunteers, like coordinators and managers who manage communities. These people always come from the volunteer background. We want them, they are employers as well. And when managers who work with volunteers know volunteering work in and out, in and out, they know the ropes, they can explain it. Diversity, well, this is something we're not really good at, but we're trying to see who's coming, how many different kinds of people we have, age groups, social backgrounds, with people with different stories, with different backgrounds. Um, there was a question whether we have disabled volunteers who have disabilities. Well, we don't have too many of those, but one of our favorite volunteers, Anton, he was in the bio lab laboratory volunteer. He has Down syndrome, and he's been coping very well with our rats and snakes. And he started working at the Polytech Museum. He's now working there in the biohacking laboratory. I think it's also very important. So these three major things that are important for us. And I never, when Matthew was speaking about it, I realized I never thought of calculating actually the return on this kind of investment, but maybe we should. Thank you very much. I'd like to give the floor to Inna, and then we'll hear Natalia's answer. I suggest Natalia goes first because she, yeah, and then we'll get back to Matthew. Speaking of effects, I know that Natalia thought about it, definitely. We need the sound though. I'll answer based on our own experience. The volunteers who came to us, they brought many people with them. And those people who learned, this backstage life of the museum, they form a community and they speak the language. They describe the museum using the language that the people around them understand. So they bring in people who already have certain expectations, some positive expectations about the museum, and they become part of the family. And I would we also have, and here I'd support Vera when she spoke about stages. We have some very good examples when we have a volunteer who went through the school of museum representation, and they grew so fond of the process. They stayed and continued their education. They went to colleges, learning about museology, learning about doing museum studies. And we had a volunteer who actually started to, well, he began to study. He made it his career and later became the museum employee. It's interesting to see volunteers who are leaders of some communities, and they have certain information channels linked to them. And it is more of a partnership relation when they spread information about our projects. I think we're working with pensioners, with retired people. Well, we have so far managed it pretty well. We refer to their experience because a lot of them speak dialects and they know like folk tales. But we had to work with them, for example, training their memory. And I think it is also a very important issue of helping elderly people cope with various hardships and disabilities, and people 70 plus working with people. We see how these people are nervous when they have to work, but they're very excited and they eventually make it. Uh, we've had some very positive effects. The only problem we're having is the funds to support them. Volunteers who came to learn more about their villages, to express themselves as actors, to get more knowledge, to gain knowledge about folk dress. They not only create dresses for themselves, costumes for themselves, they make things, make objects, artifacts for our collection, and we value it. For a small museum like ours, it's very, very important. Feedback is what important for us. We hear their initiatives, and I've already mentioned, or maybe I didn't have time for that, that we have some very active people who would come and they want to do everything. They have a lot of initiatives. They think all of a sudden realize that we need more flowers. They want to plant flowers. I think it's a very positive initiative. But some initiatives and some plans can be very, very constructive. They broaden our horizons and we understand what society expects from us. As for the economical effects, we're trying to calculate it. We calculate our expenditures, how much we spend for transport, for special events, for volunteers. And then we calculate the hours people spend for the museum. And we try to calculate how much we'd have to pay if we had to pay someone to do what they're doing. When we use this method, it becomes obvious that attracting volunteers, we do get economical effect as well.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Inna.
and Inna.
Well, I want to clarify. It's really interesting, like a minor or smaller regional museum, how it shows us how important the volunteers are on the Semenkovo case. Well, my question is what Natalia answered it about how much should we invest. But my question is to Matthew, to clarify. You said that you have analytics or statistics of the economical effects of volunteering. I mean, how high the returns of investment are against the investment itself. You said that 57% of the museum organizations in the UK do not have special position, let's say volunteers manager position. Well, or how? Why would that be if it is so obvious, if the profits and benefits are so obvious? Why would so many museum institutions lack a dedicated staff position?
So yeah, so it's actually it's around 23% that don't have a volunteer management post. The additional kind of 30% is they have junior volunteer management posts, so volunteer coordinators who won't be involved in the decision making within an organisation, so they're not able to kind of positively impact on the role that volunteers play within that museum, and that really, I mean, the role of volunteer management within the museum and its current position is very much due to the history and development of the volunteer management profession, I would say, within the United Kingdom. So typically, if you went back 20 years, volunteering was very informal. So volunteers would apply to just volunteer. They would just turn up at museums and say, "Do you want a hand?" And if a curator needed a hand, they would recruit them. Now, about, I would say, maybe 10 to 15 years ago, that started to change as organisations really started to see, actually, if we approach volunteering and volunteer management more formally, then we can actually maximise the effectiveness of volunteering. And that's you know, I started 12 years ago, so I sort of came in when we were starting to professionalise volunteer management. And so it was very interesting coming in at that time. We had a lot of volunteers who hadn't been formally recruited. So we had some very peculiar people volunteering with us. And it was obvious that we needed to put in place a kind of a structure. And we've then, since then, have seen the value of professionalizing volunteer management, and then moving on to a position where we're taking a strategic approach, and we've increased involvement. That isn't, you know, it's not hugely common across the sector. I think museums in the UK now understand that there is that actually by making that investment in a volunteer coordinator position, which is a low cost position, they can unlock the operational benefits of volunteering. So we've moved into that position. That's been a great step forwards for us and for a lot of organisations. But to really start to do, you know, some of the amazing work that we've heard about today, about kind of working with community partners, working with young people, creating these you know, really diverse volunteer programs that really are deeply aligned with our museum's strategic ambitions. We need to invest in our people, and we need to pay volunteer coordinators at a level that will allow us to recruit people with the skills and expertise to develop volunteering strategically. So it's a very much a historical process, and hopefully over the next 5 to 10 years we will move the sector forwards. And that's really our ambition with heritage volunteering, is to help organisations understand the value of volunteer management, so that volunteers can fully make a significant impact in our museum. So it's very much a historical position, and we're still on that journey, I would say.
Спасибо, Матья. Мне кажется, ты сделал хорошую сейчас подводку к итоговому нашему вопросу.
You helped us, I think, move closer to the part where we will draw conclusions from our discussion about the future of volunteering, heritage volunteering. Yulia? Well, I was thinking, and I thought of the fact that we can actually try to answer the questions from the chat, from the audience. You know, we have so many useful resources. Matthew has sent us so many wonderful links. We will forward those links and very brief written answers from our panelists through the email. So we will postpone this to later, and now we will switch to the major question that we could discuss for 2 hours, but we don't have the 2 hours. So the question is, how do you think in the current situation, which is very uncertain on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is a certainty of the fact that we're not going back to where we were, that we will have to decide what line or to pursue in the future. Will the nature of volunteering change? Will it acquire new attributes, new possibilities in the area of heritage? Well, who would like to answer first? I will answer first, if you don't mind, because unfortunately I will have to leave you in a couple of moments. So my question will be also a compliment. when we speak about volunteering and heritage together, I think there can be nothing better than the case presented by Natalia. There's not a better way to answer the questions, because you see all the components, all the necessary requirements are there. I am now doing an MA course, socially engaged practices in museums and galleries. And any of my professors would be happy to see your case and to teach it to their students, because, and Matthew will probably agree with me, it looks like close to the ideal, close to the goal that we are trying to reach, of designing and making our museums not for the visitors, but together with the communities. So really, I'm really happy to see that cases like that are present in Russia. And Yulia, answering your question, I think, well, what else can I add? The new stage, the new step is working with the communities and including the volunteers community and engaging them into the social and cultural processes, because culture does not belong to the managers of culture, it belongs to the people for whom we are actually making the programs, the exhibitions, so on and so forth. And I do thank you for this wonderful, interesting discussion, and I thank the Potanin Foundation as well. Vera, well, thank you. So I can see that Matthew wants to answer, and he's probably waving his hand to you, Vera, and he's probably also willing to answer the question.
I was just clapping because I think that was a really kind of eloquent way to sum up today and kind of really leave us on a positive note. I guess kind of from my point of view, in terms of, where do we see volunteering going in the future? I think in the UK, certainly, COVID-19 has taught us a huge amount about volunteering and what people are willing to do. What we've seen over the last 2-3 months is literally hundreds of thousands of new people starting to volunteer in causes and initiatives that allow them to tackle the problems related to COVID-19. And I think there's a tremendous amount that we can learn from this, and that we have to learn if we're going to pick up this momentum that has been generated. And I guess there's kind of three things I would say is, firstly, we need to make heritage volunteering a cause worth giving up your time to support, because what we've seen with COVID-19, if something is valuable enough, if a cause is valuable enough to people, they will give up their time to volunteer. Secondly, we need to make it easier for people to get involved and volunteer and help us. People don't want to wait 2 months to volunteer because they need to be recruited, inducted, and vetted and trained. They want to help now, and that's something we've really seen during the pandemic, is people registering with organisations and then going out to help people with their shopping, help people pick up their medication. And this really kind of ties into the last point, which is around volunteers need to be able to see and understand the impact that they make. If you're going to go shopping, you do the shopping and you give it to somebody, and you have that immediate visceral response from the person that you're helping. We need to translate that into something within our sector. And so, people want to see the difference they make. And if we can do that in the heritage sector, then that will put us in a really strong position for moving forwards. And I really believe that we need to learn from these three principles and make them core elements of our volunteer programs moving forwards. It's something in 2012, when Great Britain hosted the Olympics, there was this huge upsurge in volunteering, and after it, everybody just went, "Oh, this is great. People will just carry on volunteering. They'll just come to our museums and start volunteering." And over the last 8 years, we've just seen that number decline and decline and decline. And actually, in reality, we haven't seen anything. We haven't seen any uplift really in heritage volunteering as a result of what happened at the Olympics. And quite frankly, that's because as volunteer managers, we didn't change. We didn't do anything. We just went, okay, great. So just come and volunteer with us in our long-winded processes and in our traditional ways of volunteering. And that's why it's so important that we learn from what is happening now, certainly within the UK, and change our volunteer programs accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I also thought about, well, to what extent the borders of these groups are thin or thick. You know, there is volunteering in sports and volunteering in heritage. Do they overlap?
I would say yes, absolutely. You know, yes, there's lots that's unique and lots that make museums and heritage organisations so special, and something that we all, you know, really value, and it's what inspires us to get out of bed in the morning and go and work in those organisations. But equally, the volunteering and volunteer management it's the same, whether, you know, the issues that you're dealing with in the sports sector or within the charity sector or the community sector are very similar, because often volunteer management is ultimately about inspiring and leading people to give up their time, and that's our job as volunteer managers and people working with volunteers, is to inspire people to do that for us and our museums. And so the overlap is very thin. And actually, I work with a number of volunteer organisations across the UK. So I work with the Association of Volunteer Managers. I work with the National Council for Voluntary Organisations. And actually, you know, when we have those meetings, a lot of what we're talking about is exactly the same. So I think if there are great examples of volunteering in sport in Russia or in community settings within Russia that we can learn from as museum professionals, then we absolutely should be doing.
Thank
you very much. And I give the floor to Natalia, our speaker, for maybe the answer to this big global question, a brief answer. Oh, it's very difficult for me to answer, maybe because we live far from the capitals. In the capital, you came in touch with this pandemics. We here do not yet realize what has happened. We are opening up tomorrow for the audiences, and we face a challenge. And I'm thanking Matthew for what he said. Our retired people, who are, you know, the gem of our programs, they won't be with us, and it's a pity. But I understand that, I mean, we keep in touch with them. We develop projects for them. These projects are all online projects, of course. They have to do with what we've already taught them. They tell tales. They and children in the art school, they draw pictures, they illustrate those folk tales, and we eventually get, you know, albums and books that will help our elderly volunteers and give them a feeling of being socially important. We have other ideas that have to do with folk cooking, with local cuisine, and we have projects when elderly people gave us content, video content. They made videos. Their relatives also made videos, and we used those videos. We cut them, and we had videos made on our museum website. So we're going to work with it further on as well. I cannot give you a forecast. Of course, I mean, we're an open air museum. We are opening up because there's a lot of space, and you know, people can come. There's a lot of space for people, and I'm thinking of various options. Well, this living village will keep going, and we'll have audiences. We'll have people coming, and we'll still be able to display, to show scenes from the rural life, like we used to. I'm not, you know, being very conceptual now, but this concept, it evolves from the experience. So far, we don't have much of that experience yet. So we'll see what happens. This organic experience that you have presented today, it is really inspiring. And you say the retired people were the gem of your project. for your program. And they were also the content of your program. Yeah, they taught us as well. And this is what makes your experience so valuable. It's not an imitation. You involve people who are a part of this culture, who carry this culture. Uh, so maybe you'll work out your conceptual approach through your experience. Thank you very much. As we promised, we'll be wrapping up now and give you an opportunity to spend your Friday night working, or maybe spend it for some leisure. Maybe you would like to just sum it up in a way. It seems to me that we've launched a discussion, and we won't be able to bring our experts to speak once more, no. But we'll be able to carry on the discussion. What I see important at present, talking about the future of the heritage volunteers, and we are talking about how museums rethink themselves, redefining their functions in the future. And I think it's a very exciting conversation we might have. As for our program, we are going to be part of both professional communication and become, and inform a wider audiences. For us, for the volunteers, for the museum community, it will be very important to find answers to these questions, and we do expect your feedback, and we hope you're willing to keep this conversation up. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being part of this discussion, both the organizers and the speakers and the participants. Thank you for being so active, asking important questions. We had a real recruiting, volunteer recruiting. There are people who are willing to go to Semenkovo, to the Gulag History Museum. People are exchanging contacts, exchanging resources. We'll try to find answers to your questions, and we'll send them to you. And I hope we'll stay together. We'll keep together for the rest of our discussion and for the rest of our research, to be aware of what's going on and what and Oksana Fodina maybe wanted to say a few words in the end. Oksana, if you're with us. Yes, I'm here, and I'm happy to join. Um, and I strongly support that all the things that were said, and I would like to thank the speakers for the meaningful content they gave to this discussion. And I agree with Inna. We launched it successfully, and I do call for participation. If you're interested, the Potanin Foundation will be supporting this discussion in various forms in the media environment. We'll be talking about it. So I invite you all to join the conversation. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Have a nice weekend. We'll share the outcome and the video. We'll put it online. You've asked very important questions, and we'll keep in touch. Have a nice day. Bye. Goodbye.
Коллеги, запись и